Almost every research project begins with a research proposal, which is a document drafting the intended project and how you intend to go about it. So the what and the how are the two critical components of a research proposal. The irony, the challenge perhaps, is that the research proposal is the most difficult part of any research project, and sadly comes at the beginning. So particularly for first-time researchers, which many times is the case for master's candidates, the most difficult aspect of writing a thesis is up front. And unfortunately, there isn't really anything one can do about it, because planning the project has to happen towards the beginning of the project. So often the research proposal is intimidating, challenging, and requires quite a few attempts before people get it right. So it comes at the beginning, and it's the most daunting and challenging part of the process, because essentially the proposal asks one to conceptualize up front how to undertake a piece of research, sometimes when you've never done it before. And that is extremely challenging. So let's start with some fundamentals about a quality research proposal. I'm going to talk through three things: the proposal, and then the problem, which I think is the first half of the proposal, and then the plan, which is the second half of the proposal. So we'll talk through it under those three headings. What are the fundamentals of a quality research proposal? Well, let's go one step backwards from that and first ask, what is a research proposal? According to Mouton, a research proposal is a document that outlines how you propose to undertake your research studies. Thank you, Johan. That was very helpful. The research proposal essentially outlines two things, in my opinion. What am I going to study? And how am I going to study it? The what part is the problem. Now, by problem, I don't mean the socio-economic challenges of your nation in their entirety, described from A to Z, with everything that's happened from the arrival of the settlers until today. The problem is the researchable problem. It's an aspect of the larger problem in the broader context. So the first part of this document outlining how we're going to undertake this project explains all the critical information about the research problem. And then, having described what we're going to do, we've got to turn to how. So the second part presents a plan for solving the problem, answering the question, achieving the objective. And I would suggest we think about a research proposal in those two halves. A project, a problem, and then a plan. Once approved, the research proposal serves as a kind of contract between a student and supervisor. So we go through this whole process, which itself is a negotiation of sorts, until the researcher, the master's or doctoral candidate, and the supervisor or supervisors are satisfied that we've got a workable project. And then the proposal becomes a kind of agreement as to what's going to be done, how it's going to be done, what time frames it's hopefully going to be done within. That doesn't mean that the approved proposal is written on tablets of stone. The nature of research is dynamic. As we read, as we inquire, as we dig deeply into something, often we realize that it needs to go in a slightly different direction, have a different emphasis, etc., to what we might have imagined up front. So the upfront is an informed best guess as to where this is going and how it's going to get there. Any questions on that? Is that fairly straightforward? All right, so why important? Well, a few reasons. Again, Mouton, the greatest value of the research proposal is that it keeps the research project on course. It prevents time-consuming rabbit trails. Why? Because a well-conceived proposal not only tells you what I'm going to study, it also tells you what I'm not going to study. So if it's well conceptualized up front, it eliminates the need to pursue various avenues of reading and inquiry and digression that are not essential for the proposal. Preachers generally struggle with this. So it dramatically reduces the amount of reading you need to do and protects you against gathering unnecessary data. Told you yesterday we had a guy who ran out and went and did his interviews and surveys without getting his survey instrument approved. What's the problem with that? Well, one of the problems was he asked a whole bunch of questions that have absolutely no relevance to what he's researching. Gathering all kinds of unnecessary data, and he's probably spent months tabulating some of that data. Secondly, says Mouton, let me read secondly, I'll come back to you. So in short, prepare a good proposal and your research will flow, prepare a poor one and it will flop. I think there's an element of truth in that. So a little bit more time conceptualizing and planning the project up front normally pays big dividends later, as opposed to quickly rushing to slap together a half-baked, underprepared because you haven't done the reading legwork up front, creates a lot more work later.
There's aspect of trial and error. So are you saying that we need to, like the proposal helps you to limit the errors that you may make and then do a lot of trial. But in that trial you do a lot of, like you might look at articles, oh maybe it might help, like there's that component into it as well. So how do you say, oh no, this one we have like this?
Well, you'll never completely eliminate.
Yes.
You can't limit your reading only to such a narrow scope that it only relates directly to your research problem. But if your research definition is fuzzy, then the boundaries of what lie on the fringes of what you've got to cover become blurred. And you've got to end up doing much more than you might if you had better delimited your study up front. Okay. Now, why so many bad proposals? I guess partly the reality that this is first attempt at something new and it's the most difficult part of the process definitely contributes. So for many students, especially at master's level, one gets a lot of very poor proposals, less so in my experience at doctoral level because people have normally had an experience of doing this. But at master's level, this is often the first time somebody's not been given an assignment. So we've had 4 years of education where the lecturer says, go and read this and answer that question. Go and read X number of resources on such and write a paper about. So we are spoon-fed what we're going to do all the way through our undergrad experience, arrive at a master's degree, especially if it's thesis from day one, and for the first time in our lives we sit with a blank sheet of paper. And the lecturer doesn't tell you, go and read this, he doesn't tell you, ask that question, you've got to conceptualize it. So it is an intimidating reality. And obviously that contributes, the difficulty of the proposal phase contributes to the reason that so many initial proposals are poor. But I think there are other complicating factors. Carelessness is one of them. Students fail to edit their work even half decently. I'm generalizing, and it may not be the truth for you, but it is the truth. Thank you, Mommy. It is the truth for many. We get research proposals submitted to us that can't spell South African Theological Seminary correctly on the cover page. We get proposals that say, for a Master of Arts degree in theology, it's a Master of Theology degree. Proposals that are littered with spelling errors that would have been picked up by a word processor. And what that says to an institution or a professor is this oak's lazy and careless. If you don't take the time, if you're submitting a proposal to a professor and you don't take the time to make sure that you've done your best to clean it up and get your facts straight on at least the basics, guess what he sees at first impression? He sees somebody he doesn't want to waste 4 years working with. Carelessness, sloppy errors. So the challenge of grasping the complexities of how to do research, one's prepared to graft through those with somebody who's learning the ropes. But it's really irritating to have someone who doesn't bother to use the spell checker, who doesn't bother to get the name of the institution or the qualification, etc., right on the cover page, and so on and so forth. So pay attention to those sorts of details when you work on a research proposal. First impressions count. And the first impression of a sloppy piece of work is, I don't want to work with this oak. I don't want to spend a long time correcting his careless errors. Because if you don't get it right on the proposal, what it tells the person is you're not going to get it careful and meticulous all the way through the journey. Personally, I've not generally fussed too much about that, but we've had faculty on our postgrad committee who are particularly meticulous about little careless errors in a research proposals, spelling errors, names of things, names of scholars, etc. And for many, that's a big deal. So ignorance, we've mentioned this, the inexperienced researcher fails to understand the nature of the research proposal. This is more forgivable, but there are ways that you can get informed. Do a bit of reading about what is it does it look like. In particular, what are the expectations and requirements of the institution with which you are working or the professor under whom you are working? Because often institution requirements are specific. We generally expect the research proposal to be quite a polished document, an indication of the writing skills and ability of the candidate. Some professors and some institutions are happy for it to be a 2-page outline of what I've got in mind to do, and then they work from there. So institutional expectations vary quite widely. I'm assuming that the research proposal, for the purposes of my presentation, I'm assuming that the expectation is a fairly well conceptualized and polished document. Okay? And the third one is over-eagerness. In their haste to get on with the real work, I don't want to waste time writing and rewriting and refining this proposal. I want to get into the nitty-gritties of my research and my thesis. Often students slap together a poorly conceived proposal. I think that costs you months, if not more, further down the road. And I mentioned yesterday, SATS for a long time worked with a template. We gave headings for different sections of the proposal, and all too often you could see someone hadn't even bothered to try and understand what is meant by a research proposal and key questions and so on. They had just filled in the template, like filling in a form. So often proposals are worse than they need to be. Any questions so far? Questions about proposals?
Apart from a specific template that whatever institution might have, like, is it wise to contact your supervisor and say, apart from the template, what personally do you expect from me, like right from the beginning, or do you just go with the template and hope that he gives feedback on that?
No, it's absolutely a good idea to ask. If you've been assigned a particular supervisor and you have an opportunity to ask, what are your requirements and expectations? It's very good to ask. There are wide variations from person to person. So we have a very senior scholar, a brilliant scholar actually, by the name of Bill Domeris, as one of our supervisors, and he cares little for the minutiae of the proposal. He's not particularly interested in that. He wants a general idea of where this is going, is it plausible, and then he's happy to work with a student on designing the research from there. But in my experience, he's never had a thesis student fail, and he's had about 70 or 80 theses over his academic life. So I don't know of one that he's failed. So he gets the job done by the end of the journey. We've got another guy, Dan Dioy, equally sharp, And for Dan, if you don't get that proposal meticulous, he's going to send it back to you and say, don't waste my time. So the personal expectations do play a role, as well as institutional expectations. A fairly good idea is to ask for examples. Can you send me 3 that you deem to be appropriate in the same field? That kind of thing. Alfred.
I take your comments with interest, because here you are talking about 2 supervisors from your experience and from your institution, and you say one is very keen to looking at a proposal and the other one wants a general idea. Now, what makes is there any policy which supervisors must actually follow? Because this is more of somebody's preference, you see. I might actually struggle with you, but I can work with him quite smoothly.
Absolutely.
So what makes the ground really, clear for supervisors really to work towards making sure that I don't worry, I'm not struggling, because I would actually, if I know it is you supervising me, then I say, no, I don't want him to supervise me.
Most institutions have a process for the approval of a research proposal.
Right.
And at the end of the day, the question is, what must I do to get this through the relevant academic committee and approved?
Right.
So in our context, we've got a thing that we call a postgrad committee, and every proposal has to be signed off by the postgrad committee. So they would have a minimum set of expectations. And even the guy who's not terribly fussed about it still has to make sure the student produces something that's presentable to that committee. So find out what is required for my proposal to get passed, and try and get some examples of proposals that have been passed, because it'll give you an idea of what level of detail, etc., is being expected.
I thank God that mine was passed, so I'm much more relieved.
And just for your information, here at GWC, because it's GWC and Northwest many times, there's always a conflict. So personally, last year, I spent too much time on my proposal just because I have a supervisor here and I have a co-supervisor at Northwest. And they seem to not to be on the same page when it comes to proposal. So this one here is saying, this is fine, right from the beginning. But the one in another way is saying, no, this is not good work. So there was that kind of, it really delayed my studies. So that I guess that is a special case with regard to GWC, where you have 2 supervisors who are away from one another. And
Co-supervision, which is very common in many parts of the world, it's less common in South Africa than in other countries. But co-supervision comes with its blessings and its challenges. One gets 2 perspectives. One has to please 2 masters. So it's just part of the process.
Yeah, that has been my pain.
You're going to have to produce it to the standard of the fussier supervisor. Okay, that's the way it's going to work. All right. So, sorry.
My challenge is often, which is when I think many of us as students suffer, is before the proposal. Wooing, just writing to Dr. Smith, I am job lock in this dark corner, and I'm interested to study in this. And you find the supervisor is responding to you as if he expected the proposal, but all you are in making an inquiry about the research idea. And maybe that's something that you could touch on, because I seem to find all I'm asking this professor is, I am thinking about this. Is this an idea that you may be interested in? And he's responding to me, I expected this, and I'm like, no, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm inquiring is the possibility of this turning into a research idea. Maybe it's something that you could touch on.
I'm going to guess that from the point of view of a professor, they don't only judge the topic, they want to judge the candidate. So if you write to me and you give me a 2-line thing, say I'm interested in studying the Christus Victor understanding of the atonement from a Zulu perspective, right? I'll say, all right. And I may think that's a worthy inquiry line, but I don't just want to judge, is this a good topic? I want to judge, is this candidate worth working with? Can he put together something that's coherent? Because the commitment from the point of view of the professor is to a 3 or 4 year journey if it's a doctoral process. And so even on the first impression, they're looking probably to see some indication. Can you write a coherent paragraph? Have you given a little bit more thought? I'm hazarding a guess that that may be underlying the response. Okay? Don't know. What goes into a proposal? What should a research proposal contain? This again varies from institution to institution. So find out if the university or seminary under which you are working has specific requirements. Most primers on how to do research will give you a breakdown of what the author believes belongs in a proposal. You'd get that in Mouton's handbook on how to succeed in your doctoral research. You'd get that in Leedy. You'd get it in most primers. Here's my proposal as to what goes in. Essentially, it should have a problem section, which is the what. What am I studying? What am I not studying? That problem section should outline the topic and the aims. Objectives, key questions, they're the same thing for me. And then it should have a plan, which is the how. The type of research that is needed in order to solve the main research question. In other words, the approach. Essentially, research is a problem and solution endeavor. Identify and formulate a problem, try to solve it. Or question and answer if you wish. Formulate a research question, develop a plan that will allow you to provide an informed answer to that plan. So very simply, if you think of the proposal as being divided into a problem section and a plan section, you shouldn't be too far off the mark. What goes into each of those? I suggest that the research proposal begin with a statement of the problem. Many primers, many research authorities recommend that the first section be a background section. Background to the problem. We used to make that recommendation, and I have since removed it from my own dealings, at least removed it from being the first thing. And the reason for that move is the heading background seems to function as an open invitation for a long social discourse that isn't of primary interest at first exposure, in my opinion, for a research proposal. So when I get a proposal, if you send me 20 pages and the first 10 pages were background, I don't even read them. I scroll down to the statement of the problem, because me, myself, and I want to see, are you able to articulate a clear, researchable problem statement? And then if I can't understand your problem statement, I'll go back and skim through the background to try and put a bit of context to it. But that's a personal preference that's come out of my experience of working with the students I've dealt with. Many prefer it the other way. They prefer a background to the problem. But by background to the problem, people generally don't want more than 2 pages. And this is a challenge in Africa. where many students feel it's not appropriate to give a succinct state the problem. We need to give the whole description of how we've got there, whose families were involved, and because it's often culturally inappropriate to say this is the issue.
Disrespectful.
Huh?
Disrespectful in Africa.
It's disrespectful. No.
Yeah, you can't say this is the issue. You
Yeah.
have to come from somewhere.
Not only in Africa, in other cultures as well. There are many cultures where it's inappropriate to point your finger straight at a problem. The way you identify a problem is you speak around it, and around it, and around it, and around it, in the hope that people will eventually infer, what the issue is that you're talking about. For better or for worse, academic research is a Western invention and operates according to the conventions of the West. Pardon? Unfortunately, maybe because that's culturally foreign. But the fact of the matter is, the expectation is you need to say, the problem is that too many pastors in the Salvation Army are leaving the ministry with burnout. And I want to figure out how we reverse that. I don't want in a research proposal a list of 40 different testimonies of pastors who have been burned out, in the hope that after 20 pages of sifting through your social discourse, I will eventually figure out that you're trying to address the problem of pastors in the Salvation Army leaving. Just say it for the purposes of a research proposal. And I do understand that that is culturally foreign and challenging for many.
But I think most of it is just men who have not been taught well.
To some extent, yeah. Well, if you are not told otherwise, you will default to what is culturally natural or personally natural. Right? And if you come from a cultural background where it's inappropriate to say this is the problem, we describe and talk around it, that's what you'll do in a research proposal. And to a researcher, what that says is this: I can't figure out what the problem is. I wish he would just tell me. He's talking around and around and around it. And so often that causes a challenge. So I think the best way to start a research proposal is with a one-sentence statement of the research problem, so that it's tabled right up front, and later on we can provide some background schema to understand why this is an issue and so on.
Just in light of what you said yesterday about not having the whole thing figured out, otherwise it's not worth researching anyways. What should you be covering in?
I think you've got to know the problem.
Okay.
You've got to not know the answer or the solution.
We don't know both.
If you know both, you don't have anything to research. If you don't know either, you haven't yet got a research project in mind. Sometimes to get to a statement of the problem is very quick and easy. And sometimes it's particularly difficult and nuanced and requires a fair amount of preliminary work. But until you're able to state the problem in a single clear sentence without ambiguity, you are not ready to proceed. It's absolutely fundamental. Imagine it in the context of laboratory research in the field of medicine. A medical researcher's trying to solve some medical condition. If he doesn't know what the condition is, he has no chance of trying to explore ways of treating it. So if we simply use the medical imagery, we've got to know the diagnosis of the problem before we can design or experiment with possible solutions or explore them. Yeah.
At this stage of proposal, what happens when you discover a little bit later that actually there's somebody who has solved this problem? It's not a problem anymore.
Then you start again.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, if I'm assuming that the problem's really solved, right? So let's take it in a medical context. Let's assume that the problem is HIV/AIDS, and let's assume that Jacob finds a cure for AIDS. The problem is solved. You don't need to spend 5 years looking for a different cure for AIDS. If the problem's really solved. Now, if you think he's just a shyster and he hasn't really got the right answer, then it's appropriate to reinvestigate and say we need to dig deeper, because I don't think that's really the answer. Beetroot is helpful, but imperfect as a complete remedy for HIV. Alfred.
I think another alternative would be to look at what this guy has done. And normally at the end of each research work, and normally they would say, this research has not covered ABCD, and these are the possible other angles in which someone can actually explore further.
Correct.
So that is a way you can go about it. But also you can look at the same research and try to figure out what is missing there, and you can go into it and try to find some further solution.
Or also perspective as well. Like maybe that person coming from a particular perspective.
Yes.
And then you're coming from another angle.
Yeah,
To
sure.
say this is a problem, but I'm looking at it in this perspective.
Yeah.
And then you just need to develop further how you do that.
In a field like theology that is highly subjective, very few things are closed, are final. So-and-so did it and there's nothing more to say about the matter. It's not quite as black and white as medical research, for instance, where often the cure is definitive. And so there are often different perspectives and angles to come at the same thing, to look at it in different contexts and applications, to question whether the analysis is legitimate. But your question was, what if my problem has been solved?
Yeah.
That's how you asked me the question. And the answer would be, if your problem has been solved, then you don't have a problem. And if you don't have a problem, you don't have anything to research, so you've got to start again. Although I think that's pretty rare in a field like theology.
What happens when the problem has been solved in other discipline? So you're trying to, so for example, let's say guys in sociology solve the problem of why men tend to be angry, while people in theology haven't looked at that problem. So now you're trying to say, how can we use a solution that has been found in this particular field, which is not our field, and bring it up?
Well, I would come back to the fact that I believe social research is deeply hermeneutical, deeply interpretive, and it's very difficult to say we have the final definitive answer and everything that there is to be said about the causes of men being angry has been said and solved in another field. But in pure logic, if a problem has been solved, then there is not a problem to research. What you're saying is there is a proposed solution in another discipline. Can we enter into dialogue with that from a biblical or theological perspective? Absolutely. But the problem's then not solved. Do we accept the findings of a research report in a field of sociology as being the final word on the matter? God's whole truth. And there's nothing more to say? No. I mean, you're never gonna have a situation where. All right. So, starting with a statement of the problem. My suggestion: state the problem in one sentence. You can formulate it as a statement, as a question, or even as an objective. But it must be one sentence. Leedy says, if you can't state it in one simple, clear sentence, it's not yet clear enough in your own mind. Keep working. A main research problem is normally too large and complex to answer as a single thing, and needs to be broken down into a manageable number of logical sub-questions or sub-problems or subordinate objectives. So you've got a main problem and normally 3 to 5 main subdivisions or key questions. In some cases, a hypothesis is connected with the problems, if it's not open-ended. But in most theological research, I don't think hypotheses really drive the study. In some they do, but in most cases they probably don't. The next section of the problem part of the proposal should be to elaborate. What are the essential things that we need to expand on in order to make sure that this problem statement is clear, precise, well understood, and so on. And there you would spell out the delimitations of the study. Delimitations are things that we choose to exclude. Limitations are things that circumstance forces us to exclude. A limitation is something I cannot do. A delimitation is a self-imposed limitation. So I'm going to explore the perspectives of Anglican deacons on such and such a thing. My problem statement excludes Baptist deacons. Why? Because I couldn't investigate the opinions of the Baptist deacons as well? No, but because the practicalities of the research or the interests of the research force me to self-limit in some way. Those things need to be spelled out. What am I not studying? Definitions and presuppositions go there. And then a preliminary literature review. Normally about 4 pages, 2 to 4 pages. The purpose of the literature review is to show that you've scanned the literature sufficiently to be able to motivate that there is a real merit in investigating what you've got in mind. It hasn't been done, it hasn't been solved, or if it's been done, the discussion leaves some gaps that you want to dig into. The preliminary literature review should indicate that you're aware of the seminal works, not that you've read everything in the field. If one was writing about the end of apartheid as a regime and you neglected to engage and present Mandela and de Klerk, no matter how well you covered the rest of it, you've missed the key players. You would be deemed to have done an inadequate job. The preliminary literature review should show that you're aware of at least the key players, the seminal works, and you've done some preliminary reading. Many primers on a research proposal will tell you to put the preliminary literature research first, before the statement of the problem, because it serves as a rationale. Find out what your institution requires. My preference, as I've stated, is state the problem and later on give all the background that helps to make sense of it. It's a preference. Yes?
That's exactly almost where my struggle is, because the professor says, put your literature review somewhere in chapter 2 or 3 as you go along. I don't want it all in the proposal. Makes the proposal too long.
I agree.
And I'll
I agree. Did you miss this word?
Yeah.
Preliminary means meanly. Little, small. Oligos. Right? So this is not the full survey of what is happening in scholarship on my topic. This is a rationale for undertaking the study. It's just enough to show that the current state of the debate leaves a gap that I want to dig into. And then the next chapter or somewhere later, sometimes the whole thesis is an engagement with the relevant literature. So this literature review is 2 pages by preference, 3 at a push, and 4 if you just really are verbose. It literally is just enough to provide a rationale for undertaking the study that I'm planning.
Because I'm not sure whether you just on preliminary literature, you just say so and so, then Dean's point on this is that, while so and so is that, therefore there's a need for my study to, and then as you go along you put now fully how Bendin argues his point, rather than just the one.
Let me illustrate. Main research question. What is the redactional rationale for the organization of Psalms 20 to 25? Preliminary literature review. In the early part of the 1900s, Psalms research was dominated by form criticism, looking at the form and use of Psalms in various settings. Citations, key works, Gunkel, Mowinckel, etc. These were the key players that dominated that period of Psalms research. In 1980, a scholar by the name of Wilson published a seminal work that changed the course of Psalms research to some extent and opened up a whole new avenue of inquiry. His thesis was that the Psalms are purposefully arranged and that there is merit in exploring how they are arranged and what message the redactor intended to convey. Subsequent to his work, we can find that various main works have been published on various corpi. People have looked at Psalms 1 to 8. They've looked at the Kingdom Psalms in Psalms 90 to 96, 98, whatever. Right? But nobody's yet done this for Psalms 20 to 25. So-and-so says that Psalms 20 to 25 seem to belong together as a corpus and merit study. End of preliminary literature review. What have I done? I've provided a rationale. Here's a new avenue of inquiry, looking at the relationship and order and redaction of portions of the Book of Psalms. I've established that major works have been written on other groupings of Psalms, but nobody's done this yet on my grouping of Psalms. Ergo, main question. What are the criteria that govern the organization of Psalms 20 to 25 in the Book of Psalms? No detail, no discussion of the minutiae. I don't need to list what 20 different commentaries said about the Psalms. I'm going to have to do that later. But in the proposal, all I've got to show is I know where the field of study is at. I know where we've come from, I know where we're at, I know there's a problem beckoning. Does that make sense? And if you can't do that in 3 pages, you probably don't yet understand where the field of study is. If it was 4 or 5 pages, it's probably ballpark of what's acceptable for length. The key question for me would have been, did the way you presented it provide a clear rationale as to where the discourse is at and why the proposed thesis is relevant in the context of where the discussion is at? And then the last section of the proposal, often of the problem section, normally has a bit on the theological and practical value of the study. So why bother to do this? Why undertake this study? This is generally a relatively, most institutions don't seem to fuss too much about the why. Which is a tad mysterious, but it does seem to be the reality. Then the plan section of the proposal typically has 3 components: the research design, the research methodology, the hardest part by far to do, to write up, and the bibliography. Once again, find out what is required by your institution, because there's no universal agreement on what goes into these things. Research design is the type of research. I want to understand the attitudes of Baptist pastors in KwaZulu-Natal towards the ordination of homosexual priests or pastors. My plan is to do this by means of a literature review. Not going to work unless it's already been done. So what type of research do I need to undertake in order to answer my research question? I want to know how Psalms 20 to 25 are organized and what redactional criteria were used. My research plan is to interview church members. Not going to work. what type of research is needed to answer that research question. So the research question dictates what type of research I probably have to undertake in order to reach a reliable, credible answer to the question, solution to the problem. So the research design is the type of study. And I'll share some thoughts about models a little bit later. Then the methodology.
Sorry, just a question. So does the type of study one is doing influence the amount of literature review
Yes.
one does?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If the study is wholly literary, then of course your engagement with literature is going to be more substantial than if a meaningful portion of the study is empirical, when it's going to be a lot of time spent in data collection and analysis of primary data. So of course the type of study affects the distribution of what goes into it. The methodology section, I think, spells out step by step what you intend to do for each main question in your research. So you have a main question, and then you remember you have sub-questions. Take each sub-question and say, in order to answer this question, this is exactly what I intend to do. Methods and materials. In order to answer the next question, this is what I intend to do. And go step by step. And then, of course, a bibliography. We'll unpack those two sections of the proposal in more detail for the rest of the morning, but take care with the preparation of your research proposal. Your research proposal will be often your professor's primary first impression of what kind of a candidate you're going to be. So what message does it send? Does he get the picture that he's going to have to sift through very difficult, poorly formulated arguments? Does it look sloppy? Does it look perfectly presented? Have you referenced it properly? Have you done your homework to figure out what the institution's requirements are for the research proposal? Everyone wants to work with a student who's meticulous, careful, thorough. Nobody wants to work with a student who's sloppy and careless and rushes through putting stuff together. So first impressions are really important. And your proposal, the first draft that you attempt to send, will set a first impression. This is going to be a lot of work, or this is going to be a joy, a journey of collegial inquiry. So make a positive impression if you're doing it properly. What does that mean? Well, some minimum suggestions, and then we'll take a break. For one thing, don't make mistakes on the title page. Right? You laugh. We have students who don't know whether they're doing a DTH or a PhD with sets on their title page. Don't know what the degree is they've registered for. Can't spell the supervisor's name. Can't spell South African Theological Seminary. So you put this on the SAT site and you say, volunteers to supervise this candidate. Mass silence. Check the grammar and spelling carefully. Now, spelling errors that are missed by a word processor's spell checker are excusable. Spelling errors that are highlighted in red on your word processor are not excusable. Because even if you can't spell, you probably can see the red underline and right click and fix. So things that there are no justification for need to be ironed out of the presentation and preparation of the proposal. Ensure that the proposal conforms to the institution's requirements. every institution has its own set of expectations. How long? There's a really big one there. We make the recommendation that a proposal be about 10 pages. And often, we get 40-page research proposals. Nobody wants to read a 40-page research proposal. Least of all the committee that has to assess it. If the suggestion is 10 pages, make sure you submit it in the ballpark. 9 is fine, 13 is fine. 40 is not. If there's no stipulated length, then by all means waffle on to your heart's content. Which also makes a first impression. And keep your language modest and precise. Don't claim that you're going to solve the Middle East peace crisis. Or you're going to reconcile the Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. So keep the claims of what's going to be accomplished modest, and the language as precise as you can formulate it. Say exactly what you're intending to do and how you're intending to do it. Alright, so in summary, what's a research proposal? A 10-page, give or take, project plan that outlines precisely what am I going to study, the problem, and how am I going to go about solving it, the plan.
And that length that would be at all levels of, no, for a BTH you just want to...
Well, it's institution specific, but I think a master's and doctoral thesis proposal, 10 pages is normally ballpark in my awareness. But it must be something you ask, what are the expectations of the institution? Okay?
There's a difference between a research proposal and what we often do here in the early stages, which is say write 1 or 2 pages outlining the concept. In your project for an honours dissertation at this stage, you want probably 2 pages, which explains the kind of ideas that you're exploring and gives an idea of initial bibliography. This is a formal document that is used to register your candidacy with the university.
Right, good. Let's take about a 10-minute break. Let's start at 9:20 again.